Thanks for tuning in to For Justice's Sake, a personal injury podcast hosted by the Dixon firm in Atlanta, Georgia. My name is Renee Cooper, and I'm the marketing director at the Dixon firm. In today's episode, I'll be joined by attorney Enrique Ramos, who will help us understand more about premise liability. Thanks for being with us today, Enrique.
Thank you for having me.
Today's 15-second shout out actually goes to a place that we have been before, but they recently were in the news. It's Chops Lobster Bar in Atlanta, Georgia, in Buckhead. And unfortunately, they just had a fire. So it looks like there were no casualties, very few casualties. People were able to get out, but we just want to let them know, because it's one of Rod's favorite places, and we were able to go recently, that our thoughts are with them and the people who work there, who run the restaurant, and we hope for a speedy recovery and get you back with your doors open soon. First, a little bit of backstory. Usually when people talk about premise liability, the first thing that comes to mind is slip and fall. But there are a lot of facets to what premise liability actually is. But here are just some general numbers from my research on what slip and fall, or sometimes called trip and fall, or general premise liability can actually occur within a year. So according to some research, there are about 9 million slip and falls per year, which breaks down to 25,000 falls in a day, which seems kind of like a lot. But unfortunately, only about 5% of those even go to trial. So that actually adds up to about 95 million days of work that people can potentially miss, and $3.5 million lost in revenue per hour. So there is a lot that could possibly happen when a person has a premise liability case or a slip and fall case that takes them out of work or makes it hard for them to function in their day-to-day. So Enrique, that's what you're here to help us understand and to talk with us about today. My first question is, can you give a definition of what premise liability is?
Sure. So premises liability is a legal concept that typically comes into play in personal injury cases where the injury was caused by some type of unsafe or defective condition on someone's property. Now, premises liability is based in negligence, so the person injured must show the property owner was in fact negligent, meaning that the at-fault party had a duty to the injured party, breached that duty, and that breach resulted in an injury. Now, just because you were injured on someone's property does not necessarily mean that the owner was negligent. You have to show the property owner knew or should reasonably have known that the premises were unsafe and still fail to take proper steps to remedy the situation.
What are some examples outside of slip and fall of things that could happen on scene of a liability case like this?
Well, as you mentioned before, slip and falls are the most common type of premises liability. And slip and falls occur for a number of reasons, being poor building maintenance, badly installed staircase or walking surface, leaky roof, and more recently, snow or ice. But besides that, premises liability is not limited to slip and falls. For example, if inadequate building security leads to injury or assault, you may have a premises liability claim. Or if there were hazardous conditions on the property, like disrepair, you may have a claim. But each case is unique and may require you to overcome certain defenses or prove certain factors, which is why it is important to speak with an attorney.
So I just want to touch on, you said ice and snow are a big thing. So even in Atlanta, if it snows the one day a year, but it ices somehow 5 or 6 times a year, if you were to say, be walking on a private property and slip because it wasn't salted, this could be something that could be looked at as premises liability?
It could be, especially since it was all over the news that it was going to be ice and snow and black ice. So, especially for business owners, it's important to clean that up and, get ahead of it and salt the driveway or wherever it is customers are going to be walking, to make sure that you protect yourself from any premises liability claims and protect your customers from being injured.
Yeah. So what are examples of places most often the scene of premise liability, maybe outside of retail stores?
Well, in reality, premises liability can occur anywhere. For example, an amusement park, improper ride operation. The most common that people are aware of are height requirements. So operators should know the requirements to prevent children or others who don't meet those requirements from harm. This is why you see a height requirement warnings before you ride your favorite roller coaster. Carnival employees, the same. They have to be trained on these warnings and make sure that someone doesn't ride the ride if they don't meet the requirements. So there's certain rules and regulations that carnivals or amusement parks have to abide by to make sure that they're keeping their rides and their customers safe. So in a nutshell, when it comes to amusement parks, any kind of premises liability claim can arise out of poor maintenance, management, training, improper ride operation. Just like any other premises liability case, there are factors that have to be evaluated to determine liability. But besides that, premises liability cases can really happen anywhere, businesses, homes.
Could I claim if I got hurt in my own house that it was actual premise liability? Who would I sue in a situation like that?
So if it's your own house and it's owned by you and you're living in it, you probably would have known of any, property defect that would have caused you injury. So you may not have a claim there. But if you invited someone over to your house, and let's say you invited a friend over and it snowed and there was ice on your driveway and you didn't shovel and you didn't salt and your friend gets injured coming to your house after you invited him, then your friend would definitely have a claim. So it really depends on the status. You can be an invitee, you can be a licensee, maybe someone that's coming for business, maybe the FedEx driver, you're expecting a package and a FedEx driver is coming to your property to deliver a package and you didn't salt your driveway and he slips and falls, there may be a claim there. So in a number of ways and a number of things, you just have to be careful when you're inviting someone over, or just, make sure you're maintaining your property. And most important, make sure you have insurance.
Wow. Yeah, that is a whole different perspective of if somebody who is delivering packages or food or something coming to my house gets hurt outside. I need to be careful. So I'm going to go out and probably check on what's going on outside my house. So what if somebody is injured or has an accident at a private park? I've heard that is a little bit different than a privately owned company or location.
Yeah, so private parks are different, specifically because Georgia's legislature wants it that way. So there's special laws to protect areas set aside for recreational purposes, including those that are private property. And as a result of these rules, owners of parks and other recreational areas may claim that they are immune from liability for these injuries. Essentially, it's just Georgia legislature's way to encourage landowners to make their land and water areas available for public recreational purposes. And in exchange for that, they're going to limit your liability to certain premises liability claims. Now, it doesn't mean that they're completely immune from all claims, but it's definitely tougher. And you'd have to look for things like, a willful failure to guard or warn against a dangerous condition that the owner knew about. Or if you're charging people to be on that property, then that kind of changes things up a bit. But either way, whether or not a private park owner has immunity, there's a bunch of factors and determinations that go into that. So in those cases, particularly, it's especially important to contact an attorney and figure out if you have a case there.
I was asking about private parks, but I meant public parks. Does that change the question a little bit or the answer? I'm thinking Piedmont Park.
It's the same, with state parks or things like that, you kind of run into that same immunity. The Georgia legislature just kind of, wants people to be able to enjoy parks.
What kind of case do people have if something happens on public transit?
So when we speak on public transit premises liability, we usually refer to injuries that occur on bus stops and train stations rather than on trains or in traffic accidents. So in Georgia, we have MARTA. We also have a bunch of other public transit systems in different parts of town. And victims may be attacked on MARTA property or suffer injury in a number of different ways. And, if you were to suffer injury on the property of the public transit system, well, then they may be held liable for that. Specifically, in MARTA's case, they have a duty to maintain the conditions of its facilities and ensure that they keep it reasonably safe. They also have a duty to keep the area secure so that individuals will not have to worry about being attacked or physically assaulted on their property. So there are certain duties there that when it comes to, being at the train station or being at a bus stop and things like that, that they have to abide by, and that, you may have a premises liability claim if you were attacked at the MARTA train station or something of that sort.
So you mentioned earlier about having insurance. How important is it to have either personal insurance or for a company to be insured for a liability case like this?
Well, insurance is a great way to safeguard your personal finances from liability. If someone is hurt on your property, you don't want to have to come out of pocket for their injuries. So not only is it important to have insurance if you are the owner of a property, but it's important to have sufficient insurance. If you're underinsured, you can end up running into the same problem and having to come out of pocket for someone's injuries.
So if somebody has insurance, it doesn't mean that they can't possibly be sued. It's just that they are protected for certain amounts of medical and suffering from the victim if they do have insurance.
Correct. So if I have $1 million insurance policy, it is not likely that any claim is going to exceed that unless, someone died or something like that. But if I have a $10,000 insurance policy, well, then I may be in some trouble.
Let's use an example. Hopefully this doesn't happen to anybody, but as we saw and heard from the stats, it can happen, and it does happen quite often daily. Let's say someone was unfortunately hurt in an accident on private property. What's the first thing that they should do?
Well, depending on how hurt you are, call 911, because if you're injured, you need to be treated. But also at the same time, if police arrive at the scene and you were injured there, they'll make a report, which can be referenced later. So that's important. So for two reasons: one, for your safety; two, for the report that will be made by a police officer if they were to arrive at the scene after you call 911. Now, whether you have any kind of claim for premises liability is fact specific. So if you want to determine whether or not your injury was a result of someone's negligence, there's certain things you have to investigate: who owns the property, what was the condition, why you were injured on that property. And, an attorney can definitely help you sort through all those facts and determine who's the party that's at fault.
And how sometimes do you know who's at fault? From a standpoint, it can be a lot of different spaces. Does the attorney look at a lot of different angles?
Yeah, so, pretty much investigation. So if it happened at a building, we figure out who's the owner of the building. Is there any camera footage of the accident? Are there any witnesses? Whose responsibility was that area that you were injured in? So there are just a bunch of different factors that have to be analyzed. Definitely figuring out who owns the property is, extremely important, which can be done with some investigation and some of the tools that we use to figure out who the owner is of certain properties. And we just pretty much go from there.
Is there something that specifically determines if a liability case like this will settle or go to trial?
So it's a bunch of factors. Most important of which is, how bad were you injured? So how bad were you injured? I'd probably say next, where did the injury occur? What was the standard of care for that area? Was it, some kind of extreme negligence? So like I said, there's a bunch of different factors to kind of sort through and put together like a puzzle. Essentially, you put all these puzzle pieces together, and once you've put all the puzzle pieces together, you have a determination on, what kind of case you have, how much it's worth, and anything else moving on from there.
Lastly, are there any other aspects of premises liability that I may have missed or that you want people to know going forward to really look out for
I'd probably say another area that we see often is injuries at rental properties. So, we talked about being in your own home. Well, what if you're living in someone else's home? What if you're renting out a property from someone? You're renting out a property from a landlord. In that particular case, Georgia landlords have a legal responsibility to keep their tenants safe. They're required by law to maintain their rental properties and to keep them safe from certain types of hazards, which is why oftentimes if you live in an apartment complex, you notice they do regular inspections. They're doing these regular inspections so that way they can make sure the property is safe. And at the same time, if you are injured on the property and you notice that these regular inspections were not being conducted, well, then that may show your landlord may have been negligent in some way by not inspecting. Or if they did inspect and ignored any potential hazardous situation or defect, then again, that could bring up some kind of negligence claim if you are injured as a result of that hazardous defect. They at the same time, they can't be expected to know every single hazard in the entire property. So, that standard is, you knew or you should have known, which is why those inspections come into place. And it's important to keep track of that stuff.
So Rod had kind of talked about this on a previous podcast dealing with structural collapse. It was right around the time that the Champlain Towers fell, and there were a lot of people who I think owned and rented in that building who were hurt, missing. It was a huge tragedy. So if you are a homeowner, how do you still have the ability to look for justice from, say, the property manager or even like a homeowners association? Are those people who also hold some responsibility if you are owning, let's say, a piece of a larger building or complex?
I would say that question is extremely fact specific and will be difficult to answer. Just kind of broadly and generally, I think it would depend on a lot of different factors.
Okay, that's a good question. It means if that is specific for somebody who may be listening or someone who's had that question, they should just call us so that we can get the information and help them see if they have a case or not.
Definitely.
Well, thank you so much, Enrique, for taking the time to give us this information. It was incredibly thorough, and I know I learned something, and I'm sure our listeners and those who will find this information throughout our website or throughout social will find it incredibly impactful and helpful. So thanks for taking the time to do this.
No problem.
Continue the conversation with us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok at Dixon Firm. That's at DIXONFIRM. And for a case referral or consultation request, click the link in our description or visit dixonfirm.com. Or you can call our not so new but still shiny phone number, 888-DIXON11, which is 888-349-6611. Thanks again for listening. Stay safe for justice's sake, and we will talk with you next time.